Before we begin, we publish new content every day. So be sure to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell to get notified about our latest videos. You think you know betrayal until you're standing in your own penthouse kitchen, listening to your husband and his adult son plotting to have you declared mentally incompetent so they can seize everything you've worked 67 years to build. That was my wake-up call. The moment I realized that being kind had been mistaken for being weak. I'm Alice Stewart, and this is the story of how I turned the tables on the two men who thought they could erase me from my own life. The morning started like any other Tuesday, in our Upper West Side penthouse. Richard was reading his Wall Street Journal, making those little humming sounds he always made when something pleased him. Marcus, his 32-year-old son, shuffled in, wearing yesterday's clothes, reeking of whiskey and expensive cologne. As usual, he ignored me completely and headed straight for the coffee I'd made an hour earlier. I'd been married to Richard for 8 years, ever since my first husband died, and left me emotionally shattered. Richard had seemed like salvation then, a gentle banker who promised to take care of everything. What I didn't realize was that his definition of care involved slowly stripping away my independence, while his spoiled son treated me like an unwelcome guest in my own home. Marcus had never worked a day in his life, living off what he claimed was his mother's inheritance. He'd moved in with us 3 years ago after what Richard called a rough patch. But I suspected it was more about avoiding responsibility than any real hardship. From day one, he'd made it clear that he considered me an intruder, someone who'd stolen his father's attention and resources. That particular morning, Marcus was more agitated than usual. He slammed his coffee cup down so hard it cracked the marble counter, then turned to Richard with barely contained fury. "You promised me that money would be available this month," he said, his voice tight with desperation. "I have debts. Serious ones. And these people don't wait." Richard glanced nervously in my direction, then back at his son. "We discussed this, Marcus. Things are more complicated now. Alice has been asking questions about our finances, wanting to review everything. She's become very controlling lately." I felt my breath catch. Controlling? I'd simply asked to see our joint account statements after noticing some unusual withdrawals. As someone who'd managed her own successful landscape architecture firm for 30 years, I thought it was reasonable to understand where our money was going. "She doesn't need to know about family matters," Marcus replied, his tone growing uglier. "This is between you and me. Find a way to handle her, or I will." The way he said those last words sent a chill through me. I continued pretending to read my book, but my heart was racing. These weren't idle complaints about a stepmother they found annoying. This felt like something much darker. Later that afternoon, while Richard was supposedly at the office, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I hired a private investigator. Sophie, my daughter from my first marriage, had always been suspicious of Richard's motives. As a successful attorney, she had instincts about people that I'd learned to trust. When I called her that day, she immediately connected me with someone discreet and thorough. The investigator's name was Janet Morrison, a sharp woman in her 50s who specialized in financial fraud cases. Within 24 hours, she'd uncovered information that made my blood run cold. Richard had been systematically draining our accounts for months, transferring money to Marcus and to something called Meridian Holdings, a company that didn't seem to exist on any legitimate business registry. But that wasn't the worst part. Janet had also discovered that Richard was having an affair with a 28-year-old woman named Tiffany Walsh, someone he'd met at his bank. The photographs were devastating. Richard, my supposedly devoted husband, holding hands with this young woman at expensive restaurants, entering hotels with her, even shopping for jewelry at Tiffany and Company. The irony of her name wasn't lost on me. The final piece of Janet's report nearly knocked me off my feet. Richard and Marcus had been meeting with an elder law attorney, discussing the possibility of having me declared mentally incompetent. They'd been building a case based on what they called my increasing paranoia and controlling behavior, citing my questions about finances as evidence of cognitive decline. I sat in Janet's office, staring at photographs of my husband's betrayal and documents that proved both men were planning to have me institutionalized so they could gain control of my assets. The penthouse I'd inherited from my first husband, worth nearly $4 million. My investment portfolio, carefully built over decades. Even my late husband's art collection, pieces I'd chosen with love and which held irreplaceable memories. That evening, I returned home to find Richard and Marcus in the living room, speaking in low voices that stopped abruptly when I appeared. They both looked at me with expressions I'd never noticed before. Not affection or even mild annoyance, but calculation. They were already seeing me as an obstacle to be removed. "How was your day, darling?" Richard asked, his tone artificially bright. "Enlightening," I replied, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about reviewing our finances. Perhaps it would be helpful to sit down with our financial advisor together." Marcus's face darkened immediately. "That's completely unnecessary. Dad handles everything perfectly fine. Your interference is just causing problems." The word interference hit me like a physical blow. This was my home, my money, my life. And they were discussing it, as if I were an inconvenient child who needed to be managed. I excused myself early that night, claiming a headache. In my bedroom, I called Sophie and explained everything Janet had discovered. My daughter's reaction was swift and fierce. "Mom, you need to leave that house immediately," she said. "Come stay with David and me while we figure this out. These men are dangerous, and they're closer to their goal than you realize." Sophie was right, but I'd spent too many years being pushed around, first by grief, and then by Richard's subtle manipulation. Something had crystallized in me that day, a hardness I didn't know I possessed. I wasn't going to run. I was going to fight, and I was going to win. The next morning, I did something Richard would never expect. I got up early, made my usual elaborate breakfast, and served it to both men with a smile. I asked about Richard's day, complimented Marcus on a shirt he was wearing, and generally behaved like the dutiful wife and stepmother they expected me to be. What they didn't know was that I'd already been to the bank. With Janet's evidence and Sophie's legal assistance, I'd frozen all our joint accounts pending a full financial review. I'd also filed for divorce, citing adultery and financial fraud, with papers to be served that afternoon. But most importantly, I'd done something that would hit them where it hurt most. I'd contacted Marcus's creditors, the ones he'd been so worried about, and informed them that any debts he'd incurred were his responsibility alone, not mine or Richard's. I'd also had Janet investigate these so-called debts, and what she'd found was fascinating. Marcus hadn't been the victim of bad luck or poor investments. He'd been gambling, heavily and unsuccessfully, at illegal poker games in Manhattan. He owed over $200,000 to some very unforgiving people, and he'd been counting on accessing my money to pay them off. At exactly 3 o'clock that afternoon, a process server arrived at our door. Richard answered, his face going pale as he accepted the divorce papers. Behind him, Marcus was reading over his shoulder, his expression shifting from confusion to fury to panic in the span of seconds. "Alice, what is this?" Richard asked, his voice shaking. "This is me taking control of my own life," I replied calmly. "I know about Tiffany. I know about the money you've been stealing. And I know about your plan to have me declared incompetent." Marcus exploded then, his carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. "You crazy old bitch," he screamed. "You can't do this. Dad, tell her she can't do this." But Richard was staring at the papers, particularly the section detailing the frozen accounts. His face had gone gray. "Alice, we can work this out. There's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding," I said, "was thinking I would let you destroy me without a fight." That's when Marcus made his fatal mistake. In his rage and desperation, he grabbed my wrist, squeezing hard enough to leave bruises. He shoved me against the wall, his face inches from mine, spittle flying as he screamed that I was ruining everything. What Marcus didn't know was that Sophie had anticipated this possibility. She'd insisted I wear a small recording device, and every word, every threat, was being captured. She'd also stationed David, my future son-in-law, in a car outside our building, with instructions to call the police at the first sign of trouble. The sound of sirens approaching made Marcus release me. He looked around wildly, as if just realizing what he'd done. Richard was backing away from both of us, his face a mask of horror. The police took statements, photographed my injuries, and arrested Marcus for assault. Richard tried to intervene, tried to minimize what had happened. But the recording was clear. His son had attacked me in my own home, and his first instinct had been to protect Marcus, rather than ensure my safety. That night, I stayed at Sophie and David's apartment in Chelsea. For the first time in months, I felt safe. Sophie made tea while David reviewed the legal documents Janet had provided. Their apartment was small but warm, filled with books and plants, and the kind of comfortable chaos that comes from two people building a life together. "Mom," Sophie said, sitting beside me on their couch. "I know this is overwhelming, but you need to understand how strong your position is, legally. Richard's affair, the financial fraud, Marcus's assault, the plan to have you declared incompetent, any one of these would be grounds for divorce. Altogether, they guarantee you'll get everything you're entitled to, and more." The divorce proceedings moved quickly. Richard's attorney tried to paint me as vindictive, claiming I was using my money to destroy a family. But the evidence was overwhelming. Richard had violated his fiduciary duty as my spouse, had committed adultery, and had conspired to deprive me of my civil rights. His son had assaulted me and threatened me in my own home. Marcus's gambling debts became a matter of public record during the proceedings. The people he owed money to were not the kind to wait patiently for payment. With the accounts frozen and no access to my assets, he was in serious trouble. Richard tried desperately to liquidate his own retirement accounts to help his son, but it wasn't nearly enough. The most satisfying moment came during Richard's deposition. Under oath, forced to admit to his affair and the money he'd stolen, he broke down completely. He blamed Marcus for pressuring him, blamed Tiffany for seducing him, blamed me for being too independent and making him feel inadequate. Everyone was responsible except Richard himself. When asked about the plan to have me declared incompetent, he claimed it had been Marcus's idea, that he'd never seriously considered it. But Janet had recordings of his conversations with the elder law attorney, recordings that proved he'd been an active participant in the scheme. The final settlement was more generous than I dared hope. I kept the penthouse, my investment portfolio, and my late husband's art collection. Richard was required to pay substantial alimony and legal fees. Most importantly, both men were required to stay away from me, with restraining orders that would be enforced rigorously. Marcus's story ended less happily. Unable to pay his gambling debts and cut off from any family support, he was forced to declare bankruptcy. The people he owed money to were not pleased, and he was hospitalized twice after what were described as accidents but looked suspiciously like beatings. He eventually fled New York, last seen heading south with nothing but a single suitcase. Richard's fate was more mundane but equally fitting. The affair with Tiffany had ended badly when she realized he was no longer wealthy. He'd moved into a small studio apartment in Queens, working as a part-time consultant and struggling to make his alimony payments. The prestigious banking career he'd built over decades was over, his reputation destroyed by the fraud investigation. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I sold the penthouse. The memories there had been poisoned, and I needed a fresh start. With the proceeds, I bought a beautiful brownstone in Park Slope, Brooklyn, close enough to Sophie and David to be involved in their lives, but far enough away to maintain my independence. The brownstone came with a small garden that had been neglected for years. I threw myself into restoring it, using skills I'd developed during my career as a landscape architect. Working with my hands in the soil, planning and planting and nurturing growth, became a form of therapy I hadn't known I needed. Sophie announced her pregnancy in the spring, and I found myself looking forward to being a grandmother with an excitement I hadn't felt about anything in years. David proved to be not just a loving son-in-law but a genuine friend, someone who valued my experience and insights, rather than seeing them as threats to his authority. I also started volunteering with a legal aid organization that helps elderly people who've been victims of financial abuse. My story had become something of a cautionary tale in certain circles, but also a source of hope for other women who found themselves in similar situations. The work was deeply satisfying. Too many older women, I discovered, had been conditioned to be accommodating, to put others' needs before their own, to the point where they couldn't recognize abuse until it was almost too late. I became someone they could talk to, someone who understood the complexity of loving people who were harming you. 1 year after that terrible morning when I'd overheard Richard and Marcus plotting against me, I was sitting in my new garden with a cup of coffee and the morning newspaper. The flowers I'd planted were blooming magnificently, and I could hear Sophie and David arguing playfully about baby names through their open window next door. My phone rang. It was Richard. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice sounded older, more tired than I remembered. "Alice, I know I have no right to call," he said. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm sorry. Really, genuinely sorry for everything I put you through." I listened as he explained that he'd been in therapy, trying to understand how he'd become capable of such cruelty toward someone he'd claimed to love. He didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation. He simply wanted me to know that he understood the magnitude of what he'd done. When he finished speaking, I found myself responding with more kindness than he deserved. I told him I was glad he was getting help, that I hoped he could find some peace with himself. But I also made it clear that there would be no relationship between us going forward. No friendship or reconciliation. After I hung up, I sat in my garden, thinking about forgiveness. Not the kind that means pretending terrible things didn't happen, or welcoming toxic people back into your life, but the kind that means releasing the anger that had been eating away at me. I forgave Richard and Marcus not for their sake, but for mine. The baby arrived in September, a perfect little girl named Grace. Holding her for the first time, looking into those bright, curious eyes, I felt something I'd thought I'd lost forever. Pure, uncomplicated joy. Here was someone who would grow up knowing she was cherished. Someone who would never have to wonder if she was worthy of love and respect. Sophie proved to be a natural mother, confident and nurturing without being anxious. David was the kind of father who changed diapers without complaint and could calm a crying baby with ridiculous songs he made up on the spot. Watching them together, I realized what a healthy relationship actually looked like. The mutual respect, the shared responsibilities, the way they supported each other without trying to control or diminish each other. As Grace grew from infant to toddler, I found myself thinking less and less about the dark period with Richard and Marcus. They'd become characters in a story I sometimes told. Cautionary figures who'd taught me important lessons about self-worth and boundaries. But they no longer had the power to hurt me. I'd started dating again, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. At 70, I discovered I had no interest in settling for companionship or convenience. I wanted partnership, equality, someone who would challenge and inspire me rather than trying to manage or diminish me. Through a friend from my volunteer work, I met James, a retired professor of art history, who shared my love of gardens and good books. Our first date was at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where we spent 4 hours wandering through exhibits and talking about everything from Renaissance painters to the challenges of urban beekeeping. James was nothing like Richard. He was interested in my opinions, supportive of my independence, and secure enough in himself that he didn't need to control or change me. When I told him my story, his reaction was anger on my behalf, not judgment or advice about how I should have handled things differently. We took things slowly, both of us having learned from past mistakes about the importance of really knowing someone before making commitments. But after 2 years of dating, when he asked me to marry him, I said yes, without hesitation. Our wedding was small and perfect, held in my garden with Grace as an enthusiastic flower girl, and Sophie and David as our witnesses. James had 3 grown children who welcomed me warmly, and his grandchildren immediately adopted me as their extra grandmother. Looking back now, 5 years after that terrible morning when I overheard the plot against me, I can honestly say, I'm grateful for the experience. Not grateful that it happened, but grateful for what it taught me about my own strength and resilience. I learned that kindness doesn't require self-sacrifice, that love without respect is worthless, and that it's never too late to demand better for yourself. I learned that women of my generation were often taught to be accommodating to the point of self-destruction, but we don't have to accept that programming. Most importantly, I learned that the people who truly love you will never ask you to make yourself smaller, to make them feel bigger. They'll celebrate your strength, support your growth, and stand beside you when you need to fight for what's right. My story spread through word of mouth in ways I never expected. I started getting calls from women across the country who'd heard about my situation and wanted advice about their own. Some were dealing with financial abuse from adult children. Others were trapped in marriages where they'd been slowly eroded until they barely recognized themselves. I always told them the same thing. You have more power than you think you do. You deserve to be treated with respect and dignity. And it's never too late to reclaim your life, no matter how old you are, or how long you've been accepting unacceptable treatment. The brownstone garden has become something of a neighborhood gathering place. Sophie brings grace by almost daily, and other young families have started stopping by to admire the flowers and chat. I've become the grandmother figure for several children whose own grandparents live far away. James and I travel now, something I'd always wanted to do but never felt free to pursue during my years with Richard. We've been to Italy, Japan, and Scotland, always returning home to Brooklyn with new appreciation for the life we've built together. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never overheard that conversation, if I'd remained oblivious to Richard and Marcus's plans until it was too late. Would they have succeeded in having me declared incompetent? Would I have ended up in some facility while they lived in my penthouse and spent my money? The thought still chills me, but it also reminds me how close I came to losing everything because I was too trusting, too willing to avoid conflict, too conditioned to put others' comfort before my own safety and well-being. I share my story now not for revenge or sympathy, but as a reminder that predators often target older women because we're seen as vulnerable, isolated, and unlikely to fight back. They count on our desire to keep peace, our tendency to blame ourselves for relationship problems, our fear of being alone. But we're stronger than they know, and we have more allies than we realize. The legal system, when properly utilized, can protect us. Adult children who truly love us will support our right to dignity and autonomy. And other women who've survived similar experiences will stand with us when we need to fight. My name is Alice Stewart. I'm 72 years old, happily remarried, and the grandmother of the most wonderful little girl in the world. I live in a house I chose, surrounded by people who value and respect me, spending my days exactly as I want to spend them. 5 years ago, 2 men thought they could erase me from my own life. Instead, they taught me how strong I really am. And that, perhaps, is the greatest gift they could have given me, though I doubt they intended it that way. The garden is calling, Grace is coming for her afternoon visit, and James is making his famous lasagna for dinner tonight. This is what victory looks like. Not revenge, not destruction, but a life lived fully and freely, surrounded by love that lifts you up instead of tearing you down. That's my Manhattan reckoning, and I wouldn't change a single moment of it. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, drop a like and a comment, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on our new content.